Miriam, if you want to go ahead and bring the lights down, that would be just fine. Just as a quick recap, last week, as we started this journey, we looked at first Bethany and then in Jerusalem, in Jesus as they come along. First off, Jesus was anointed, if you recall, in Bethany with the jar, the alabaster jar, with the nard, pure nard, very expensive. But it was the most beautiful movement and moment of that day because he was anointed for his death. No one else even considered it. But then they move on to that Wednesday when they move into Jerusalem. Again, they set up the meal on Thursday. Judas plans to betray Jesus, and he leaves the meal, and then they have the meal. In fact, the last verse that was read last week by Donita is going to be the first verse that Anthony reads this morning, the very first verse. And so why don't we start with that verse, as well as the next few. Yep.
When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. "You will all fall away," Jesus told them, "for it is written, 'I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered.' But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." Peter declared, even if all fall away, I will not." "I tell you the truth," Jesus answered. "Today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times." But Peter insisted emphatically, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." And all the others said the same.
I think we all know this story a little bit, but let's look at it from a little different direction too. We're told first and foremost by Mark that they sang a song that evening before they left. Well, what did they sing, do you suppose? Well, it would have been from the Hallel, is what it's called. It's Psalm 113 through 118. And this is a group of psalms that are traditionally sung on Passover, even to this day. Personally, having read all of those psalms numerous times, that I would like to think that they probably sang Psalm 118. And the reason I say that is listen to some of the words. It says, "Give thanks for the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever." But then it goes on and says this, "In my anguish I cried out to the Lord, and yet he answered by setting me free." A little later on in the psalm it says, "Shouts of joy and victory." But then it says, "I will not die, but live." Little prophetic words are about what's to happen here in the next few weeks that we're going to talk about, are they not? So once they sing this song, they leave the upper room. They leave probably through the eastern gate of Jerusalem, and they head east across the Kidron Valley, and then they climb the winding path that goes up to the Mount of Olives. And they go to a quiet place that Jesus is known to be there whenever he's in the region of Jerusalem. Sometimes he goes to Lazarus' house, and Lazarus and his 2 sisters. But quite often, they go to a quiet place, and it's always on the Mount of Olives. So a lot of people know he's even there. But during this trip, I don't know if you caught what Anthony said, a rather vocal, heated exchange erupts between, I should say, Jesus and Peter, but you'll find out that it was more one-sided. And this is Peter, the very same Peter who once was just a lowly fisherman, but now he's, even though he's been with Jesus for 3 years, he's still brash, stubborn, often acts before he even thinks. And you would think after all that time he would be a little different. I mean, if you think about what Peter has seen and done over these 3 years, he's walked on water, for crying out loud. He was the first to recognize Jesus as the Christ. He becomes a part of Jesus' inner circle, the 4. And he saw Jesus transformed on the mountain. How could you not be changed? And I'm sure, though, Peter feels that he's very bold and he's Jesus' right-hand man, right? He's his number one disciple because Jesus said to him not long ago, I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. Wow, wouldn't that make you a little heady thinking? Let's face it, the spotlight is on Peter, and I'm sure he feels that he can do no wrong. We have to understand, even in our own lives today, 2,000 years later, it's pretty dangerous when we start to believe our own press. To believe that because of our acquaintances or our accomplishments that we are in control of our own lives, that we are large and in charge, if you will. But Jesus brings all of them back to reality by telling them that you all are going to fall away, he says. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will scatter. He's quoting from Zechariah chapter 13, verse 7. But then he goes on to say, after I am raised up, I will go ahead of you to Galilee. I am raised up. Sounds familiar, those words. And if you've paid attention over the last few weeks too, Jesus at least 3 times during his journey with the disciples has said to them, I'm going to die and I will arise in 3 days. And you would think Peter would have really recognized those words, because at one of those moments when Jesus said, I'm going to die and arise in 3 days, that Peter says, I will never allow this to happen to you. And what does Jesus say? Get behind me, Satan. Because he knows that Peter is not, he's trying to get in the way, being a stumbling block of what God's plan is. So you would think Peter would have gone, I remember this. But instead, Peter just reacts. No, you can't say that. You can't mean that, Jesus. Not all of us, especially not me. You can hear Peter saying that. Even if everyone else falls away, I won't. Some things about Peter just don't change, huh? And wouldn't we all feel somewhat like that? Let's face it. We try to do the right things. We try to follow the laws. In fact, here we are. We're attending church. We pray. We read scripture sometimes. We profess our love of Jesus. So no, we won't fall away. Will we? But then Jesus turns directly to Peter and he says, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter responds to this by saying, and my Bible actually says, most emphatically. Those are pretty stout words, are they not? He says, how can you say that? Don't you know me? I'm Peter. I'm the rock. I'm your number one. I love you more than anyone, right? That's what he said that night. It's as if he's asking, what else must I do to prove my loyalty? What else must I do to prove my love to you? Do I have to die for you? And then he says, I will if I must. But I will never deny you, my Lord. Famous last words, huh? Some things never change. Even today, we all ask, what more must I do for you, Jesus, to earn your friendship, your love, your presence in my life? Like Peter, I think we all try to express our love for Jesus through our actions. But if we're not careful, our actions ultimately turn into works. And we all know what James said about works. Works of what we feel is our duty. Our works, whatever they may be, must always be a response to Jesus' love, never done in order to earn Jesus' love. You catch the difference there? That's the main difference. Jesus reminds us that in order to have this loving relationship with him, it's his love of us that brings about the relationship, and it's never the other way around. And then Jesus, I love this, he turns and he just silently continues to walk through the night. And if we notice that he does not even respond to Peter in what Anthony read. In fact, he is just going to let Peter's actions speak for themselves.
Verse 32. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray."
Just a brief little verse, but I think it's the perfect time to set the stage of where they're at. They started the meal probably at 6 o'clock, maybe a little later. That's when sundown starts in the Jewish clock. They have their meal, they pray, and then they leave. It is probably very close to midnight by the time they get up the winding path up to the Mount of Olives. So what I want you to do is just think about it for a moment. Possibly feel that it's the chill of the night as they hit the top of a hill. As they're walking through the first part of the grove of olive trees, we see that there's a pale moonlight that's been streaming through the branches of the trees, and there's a little puddles of white on the grass. There's a light mist possibly rising from the grass because it was a hot day, but now the cool of the night is turning it into mist. And here's a small band of men. They're silently moving together through this olive grove. Jesus stops and he points, and he selects 8 of them, and he asks them to just sit and wait. So they settle under a couple of trees, and Jesus and 3 others, they continue deeper into this grove.
In verse 33 through 36. He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he said to them. "Stay here and keep watch." Going a little farther, he fell to the ground and prayed that, if possible, the hour might pass from him. "Abba, Father," he said, "everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will."
I think this reading right now is rather appropriate with a storm raging outside. Jesus stops and he instructs Peter, James, and John to wait here. But he also says to keep watch and to pray. So they set. Jesus goes even deeper into the grove, and he goes toward the Gethsemane. Now, many of us, because of the one hymn, we even think in terms of this garden is called Gethsemane. But we have to understand at Gethsemane what it is. It's a huge stone that crushes the olives to make the oil, the olive oil. That's what a Gethsemane is. Peter, James, and John, they settle themselves against a tree because of the supper and the long walk. And it's over midnight now. They soon begin to feel tired and yawn. They start to nod, and very soon they fall asleep. Jesus is now not only down through the grove a little deeper, he's completely alone in the grove. Jesus then, standing there, he begins to sway back and forth. His breathing now comes in short gasps. He covers his face with his hands, and all at once he crumples to the ground and he cries out, "Abba, Father!" His voice is harsh and it's shrill in the night. His fingers dig into the earth and he falls forward with his face to the ground. "Oh, Abba, Father, I don't want to do this. Please, this cup, take it away from me." His voice becomes hoarse now. He inhales quickly, but then he cries out, "There's death in this cup. Sin is in this cup. Pain. This cup is going to tear me away from you. Please, Abba, if I drink of it, you're going to hate me. You will forsake me. Abba, Father, take this cup away from me." But then Jesus rises back to his knees. He straightens his back. He turns his face to heaven. His eyes are tightly shut. inhales again deeply. He steadies himself and he whispers, "Nevertheless, Abba, not what I want, but may your will be done."
In verse 37 through 42. Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Simon," he said to Peter, "are you asleep? Could you not keep watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the body is weak." Once more he went away and prayed the same thing. When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. They did not know what to say to him. Returning the third time, he said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Enough. The hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer."
Did you notice the first couple, 3 words that Anthony spoke of? He said that when Jesus comes to the 3, he says, "Simon." He didn't say Peter, did he? All through the gospel, I think it's interesting to note that when Jesus is happy with him, he calls him Peter. When he's disappointed in him, he always calls him Simon or Simon Peter. So in that pale moonlight, Jesus returns to the 3 that had been left to guard and to pray, finds them asleep, and Jesus again is alone. Even here with his friends, he's completely alone. He returns to his quiet place, and he prays a second time, a prayer that is actually emotionally as charged as the very first. He prays until sweat drops from his forehead and runs down like drops of blood. It's as if the pressure of the world is crushing him with the same force that the Gethsemane crushes olives. He cries out again. His voice is now echoing through the trees, "Abba, Father!" And yet his friends still sleep. His third prayer, when it's offered, is quiet, and it's private, and yet it's filled with anguish. In the darkness, in the silence, Jesus waits and waits. When he finally returns to his friends, he must wake them with the news of his coming betrayal. His words are, "Arise, the hour has come." You see, Jesus is in control. He knows what he must do and what is happening. And in this moment when Jesus begins to drink from the cup that God has set before him.
Verse 43 through 49. Just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared. With him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests, the teachers of law, and the elders. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. Then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. "Am I leading a rebellion," said Jesus, "that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you, teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me. But the scriptures must be fulfilled."
Again, it's probably maybe 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, pitch black except for possibly the moon yet. But when you look off down into the Kidron Valley and then coming up, there's a blazing line of flaming torches, and it's winding in its way eastward through the very night, and it's following the same path that Jesus and the disciples took earlier that evening. Perhaps the disciples see it, but they don't yet understand what is coming, what is about to happen. But Jesus knows. This blazing line of flame is going to be fatal when it arrives, and it will kill with a kiss. Its strength comes from the armed guards of the temple and the security force of the Sanhedrin, and they are directed by the high priest and the other servants of God who stand ready to unleash their full force against Jesus, this one lone rabbi. And at the very head of this powerful force is one of the 12, one that Jesus had chosen. Judas Iscariot suddenly appears and takes his place alongside his group of friends, the disciples. He settles in and he smiles. Can you imagine? Yet he smiles at each disciple. But then Judas takes his torch and he holds it a little higher. He starts shedding the light on each person around him. Who's he looking for? Nope, not John. Nope, not James, or not even Bartholomew. But then when he turns far enough around, he finds him, Jesus. They see that he smiles and concentrates on Jesus, so the guards move into a tight circle surrounding the disciples. Their swords and clubs are ready to be used when the sign is given. There's a silence except for the sounds of the flickering torches. The tension of the moment is almost unbearable. The disciples and the guards eye each other with distrust and with fear. But Jesus, on the other hand, he's just standing a little away from the group. He's calm, he's in control, and his face appears to be almost serene as he awaits for what is to come. Judas, who's still smiling, calmly walks over to Jesus, stands in front of him and smiles, and he says, "Rabbi." And then he leans forward and he kisses him on the cheek. Who could ever imagine that a kiss would be used for anything other than affection or devotion or just respect for the rabbi? But now this kiss is used as a sign of identification. It's a sign to signify who to seize and who to arrest. It's a sign of betrayal and a sign of pending death. Imagine, with the use of a sign of affection, the very war between good and evil begins. And it's a fight for the world. And the battle begins with a kiss. What a sad, heart-wrenching moment this had to have been. Yet this is just the beginning of what Jesus called my hour. This is just the first few sips from the cup of his suffering. Yet even now, in the dark moment, we too must be strong, and we need to keep our faith. For Jesus said, "I have overcome the world." We must remember that. So let the scriptures be fulfilled.
Verse 50 through 52. Then everyone deserted him and fled. A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind.
The question we need to ask now is, when did the disciples actually desert Jesus? Was it when the violence first broke out, the fight? Or was it during the confusion as each was trying to grab and to detain or escape from one another? Maybe it was when the ear of the high priest's servant was cut off by Peter, by the way. Or maybe even during the act of compassion when Jesus calmly reattaches the ear to the servant. Possibly when Jesus asked the guards, "Why are you here? Why here? Why now in the middle of the night?" And then he reminds them that he was teaching in the temple every day right out in the open. It would have been simple to obtain him then. If you recall, just a few hours earlier, every disciple agreed with Peter that they would never desert Jesus. And they would die for him if need be. It appears also that all of these brave words that they had said are now totally forgotten, because Mark tells us they all deserted and they fled. Mark then brings us a brief story, though, of a young follower who was dressed only in a tunic. As he attempts to get away, he loses this clothing and yet runs away into the night. And that's all we know. Why do you suppose Mark added this slight detail to this story? Well, some, believe it or not, think that this unnamed young follower was actually Mark himself, because Mark goes on later and he follows with Paul and with but he was with Silas and Paul and Bartholomew and the others, spreading the gospel. It could have been Mark. Or possibly Mark just adds this story to show a little insult towards the disciples' own cowardly actions. Or maybe he adds this story so that it becomes a metaphor about those who would want to be followers of Jesus. We all claim to side with Jesus, do we not? We claim to follow him, claim to love him. We stand with him no matter what. The question is, though, will we be strong enough to stand with Jesus when we, like the disciples, are forced to choose what to do? We find ourselves always having to make a decision that could lead us to alienation, ridicule, persecution, and yet even death. That's happening to our fellow Christians, brothers and sisters around the world as we speak. As mentioned earlier, Jesus has warned us of his suffering and pending death, but he's also said that if we intend to follow him, and these are Jesus' own words, we must deny ourselves and take up our cross. And I need to make a comment here. I've read that probably 15 times, and then all of a sudden it hit me. This happened 1.5 years to 2 years before Jesus was crucified. And yet he was then telling the disciples, you're going to have to take up your cross. You see, again, he knows what's coming, and he knows what's going to be laid on our hearts. But he also said that if we save our lives, that is, run off into the night, we just may lose it. But if we lose our lives for his sake, we will indeed save it. So as followers, how can we ever ignore such words that have been spoken? And then there are these words. The cup that I drink, you also will drink. Ooh. Being a Christian is pretty hard work, isn't it? The cup. As Christians, I think we all agree that yes, we will drink of this cup. And yes, we will, by gum, we will do it and mean it, right? And we'll do anything for Jesus. Anything, right? Well, we need to look around. Just look outside. The cup is here. And it's here and it's now. The world is still at war. And the world is warring over good versus evil. And in this world, you and I are participants, whether we want to be or not. And because we are, we each will be called on, and we're going to have to choose to either stand with Jesus in the cup or to choose to run naked and exposed into the night. Amen. Next week, we will be entering the high priest's house after the arrest. Let's say a prayer for a moment. Dear Lord, the emotion, the charge that you went through, and you did it for us. We've just truly entered this story. And it gets tougher and tougher to hear. But we know that there is sunrise at the end. Help us to see and to understand, but also to deeply understand that this is who we are, and that we follow you, and we do follow you willingly. Give us courage and strength to be true to you. Amen. Our closing hymn is Lord, Listen to Your Children Praying. If you're able to, let's stay seated. To your children praying. Lord, send your spirit in this place. Lord, listen to your children praying. Send us love, send us power, send us grace. Lord, listen to your children praying. Lord, send your spirit in this place. Lord, listen to your children praying. Send us love, send us power, send us grace.
Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Jesus replied, "Do what you came for, friend." Then the men stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all the disciples deserted him and fled.
You may go in peace.